It was the beginning of autumn, and I and two friends, Josh and Emily, were bored on a Friday night. Josh suggested we explore an abandoned factory that was about a 15-minute drive away. The place was known in town as a meeting point for local legends, strange sounds, apparitions, and rumors that something evil still resided there. Despite the stories, we decided to go. It was the biggest mistake of our lives. The factory was huge, with bricks covered in moss and broken windows that reflected the little light from the moon. The main gate was locked with chains, but Josh found an opening in the barbed wire fence. As soon as we entered, the air felt different. It was colder and had a smell of burnt oil mixed with something rotten. The interior was almost intact, as if the machines had been abandoned suddenly. Rusty tools were scattered around, and there were old papers still pinned to the bulletin boards. "It seems like people just vanished," Emily said, her voice echoing through the empty hall. Josh, always curious, started fiddling with the remains of the machines while I looked around, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. We walked through the dark corridors, lit only by our flashlights. The silence was so deep that any sound, even our footsteps, seemed deafening. While exploring a storage room, Emily found a pile of old boxes. Inside were files and notebooks with strange notes. Some pages were scrawled with drawings of eyes and hands, accompanied by phrases like, "It's here, it always was." Who would write something like this, I asked, while Josh just shrugged. He seemed more interested in opening a heavy door that was locked with chains. After some effort, he managed to pry it open. Behind the door was a staircase leading down to the basement. The air coming from there was even colder, and the smell of decay intensified. Emily hesitated, but Josh insisted. "It's where the most interesting things usually are." We carefully descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath our feet. The basement was immense, with low ceilings and walls covered in dark stains. The sound of dripping water echoed through the space, but there was no sign of where it was coming from. In the back, we saw something that made us stop. A chair was positioned in the center of a room, with rusty chains and shackles attached to it. On the floor, there were dragged marks, as if something or someone had been pulled from there recently. "This is horrible," Emily said, her voice trembling. Before we could react, we heard a sound coming from behind us. Something fell with a crash, echoing through the basement. Josh pointed his flashlight down the corridor, but there was nothing there. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, but Josh was already walking into another room. He shone his flashlight inside and suddenly stopped. "There's someone here," he said quietly. Emily and I moved closer and looked. In the corner of the room, something was crouched. It was a dark figure with pale skin that glowed under the flashlight. Its eyes were deep, like holes, and its body seemed twisted in a wrong way. Suddenly the thing moved, so fast it almost seemed to vanish into the darkness. We ran toward the staircase, but the steps felt endless. The sound of something following us grew closer, heavy and clumsy footsteps echoing down the corridor. We reached the ground floor, but the factory seemed different. The way back was blocked by machines that hadn't been there before. Josh started pushing one of them while Emily and I looked around. That's when we heard it. A laugh. Low, raspy, and impossible to be human. I looked to the other side of the hall and saw something watching us. The same figure from the basement now standing, its head tilted in an unnatural way. I don't know how, but I felt it was smiling. Josh managed to clear a path, and we all ran for the exit. When we finally got outside, the air felt lighter, but something was still wrong. Looking back, I saw the figure standing in the factory door, motionless, just watching us. We reached the car and drove away in silence. When we finally got home, each of us went to our corners, not saying much about what had happened. That night, something strange occurred. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like I was being watched. Looking out the window, I saw something outside. It was the same figure standing on the street looking directly at me. I don't know what was in that factory, but I feel like we never really left. Since that night, Josh and Emily have been having recurring nightmares, and I constantly feel watched. Some places should remain closed. Whatever inhabits that factory does not like to be disturbed. Relato 2. It was a Sunday night, and I was bored. I have always been curious about abandoned places, and there was an old factory on the outskirts of town that had caught my attention since childhood. They said it closed after a terrible accident involving employees, but I never believed the stories. I decided to explore the place alone. It was the biggest mistake of my life. The factory was isolated, surrounded by a barbed wire fence that was almost entirely down. The main gate was ajar, with peeling paint and covered in rust. I entered with a flashlight and my backpack, trying to ignore the chill I felt as I passed through the entrance. The interior was immense, filled with rusty machines and corridors that seemed endless. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls had dark marks that resembled soot. Despite the absolute silence, the factory had a presence. I can't explain it, but it felt like the place was alive. I told myself it was just my imagination. I began to explore, shining the flashlight into corners and observing the old machines. Some still had remnants of tools, as if someone had left in the middle of their work. I found a large hall in the center of the factory, where the main machines probably were. On the floor, there were marks of wheels that looked recent. This made me uncomfortable, but I kept walking. As I examined the area, I heard something. A low sound, like a faint crack coming from the corridor behind me. I froze, trying to listen better. Maybe it was the building settling, I thought. I turned off my flashlight for a moment, letting the darkness take over. It was then that I heard it again. A sound of footsteps. Slowly, I turned and pointed the flashlight down the empty corridor. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, but there was no response. I continued walking, but now my heart was racing. In one of the corridors, I found a metal door with the word "restricted" written in faded red letters. It was clear that I shouldn't go in, but my curiosity got the better of me. The door was unlocked. When I opened it, I was greeted by a staircase leading down. The air that came from there was cold, with a smell of rust and something else, something rotten. I descended the stairs slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. At the bottom, I found a basement with low ceilings and a single flickering light on the ceiling. In the center of the room was an old chair turned sideways. Around it, marks of something dragged across the floor led to a door in the opposite corner. I approached the chair, illuminating it with my flashlight. It was dirty, with stains of something that looked like dried blood. A shiver ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to leave. When I turned to go back up the stairs, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a laugh, low, hoarse, almost imperceptible, but definitely a laugh. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The only response was the sound of the door in the corner of the basement slowly opening. My flashlight trembled as I illuminated the now open door. There was nothing inside, just darkness. But then I saw something, a figure. It was crouched down as if hiding, but its eyes shone in the darkness, two white points reflecting my light. I froze, unable to move. The figure began to rise slowly until it was standing. It was tall with awkward movements, as if its bones weren't in the right place. When it took a step toward me, I was able to move. I ran up the stairs, feeling the sound of footsteps behind me. They were not like mine. They were heavier, dragging and coming faster and faster. When I reached the ground floor, I looked back for a moment and saw the figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Its head was tilted, and it seemed to be watching me. Then it began to climb. I ran for the exit, but the main gate was now closed. I pushed with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around, desperate, and saw a broken window nearby. I threw myself through it, cutting my arm on the glass, but I didn't care. As soon as I was out, I started running, not looking back. When I finally got home, my body was trembling. I locked myself in my room and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure watching me. The next day, I told the story to a friend who also liked to explore abandoned places. He told me that the factory had been closed after a strange incident involving an employee who disappeared. Some say he never left. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm home alone at night, I hear footsteps, heavy, dragging, like the ones I heard on that staircase, and I wonder if I really left that thing in the factory or if it followed me home. A few months ago, I got involved in something I never should have started. It all began when I found a mysterious reference to an old factory on an online urban exploration forum. They said the building had been closed in the 80s after a failed experiment. The few available details suggested that the factory was isolated, hidden in the middle of a forest. They claimed that no one who entered came back the same. My curiosity outweighed my common sense. I decided to go alone. The location of the factory was vague, but with some research, I managed to trace it to a forgotten spot on the map, surrounded by miles of forest. I took my car and drove until the road ended. From there, I continued on foot, guided by an offline GPS and a bad feeling. When I finally found it, the sight was disconcerting. The building was colossal, almost completely swallowed by vegetation. The windows were broken and the walls were covered in moss. There was a rusty sign near the entrance with the name Novex Corporation and a phrase below, "Researching the Future." The place seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. Objects were scattered outside, including equipment I couldn't identify. The main door was ajar, as if waiting for me. As soon as I stepped inside, I was greeted by an oppressive silence. The main hall was spacious, with grey walls and a ceiling so high that my flashlight barely reached it. In the center, there was a counter with papers strewn about and a large burn mark on the floor. As I walked through the corridors, I noticed that many things were intact. Chairs, tables, and even files. It was as if the people had disappeared suddenly. Even stranger were the marks on the walls, like deep scratches made by something not human. In one of the rooms, I found what appeared to be a laboratory. There were tables with broken instruments and glass tubes filled with now dried liquids. On one of the tables, there was an open notebook with incomplete notes. The pages spoke of a Project N9 and mentioned something about human potential beyond limits. The air grew heavier as I read. That's when I heard the sound. A crack. Something had fallen in the hallway behind me. I turned off my flashlight, holding my breath. The sound of footsteps began, slow but steady, coming in my direction. I waited a few seconds before turning the light back on and pointing it toward the hallway. There was nothing there. I continued walking, now more cautiously. I found another door marked Restricted Access. The lock was broken and the door was slightly open. My instinct told me to leave, but my curiosity won once again. Behind the door, there was a staircase leading down to a basement. The air down there was different, cold and heavy with a metallic smell. I descended slowly, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a corridor lit by a weak, pulsating light. The floor was wet, with marks that seemed to be from something dragged. At the end of the corridor, a large steel door was open, revealing an even stranger space. It was a circular room, with metal-clad walls and old cameras pointed at the center. In the middle stood a kind of glass capsule, now shattered. Around it, old monitors displayed static images, but one of them flickered with the phrase, "Don't trust what you see." As I examined the room, I heard a low, constant sound, almost like a hum. It seemed to come from all sides, gradually increasing. I looked at the monitors again, and the phrase had changed. "She's with you." Pointing the flashlight toward the entrance, I saw a shadow in the corridor. It hadn't been there before. It was tall, thin, and moved erratically, as if every movement was made with effort. The figure entered the room. I can't explain what it was. It looked human at first glance, but its eyes glowed with a silvery hue, and its skin was too pale, almost translucent. It stopped in the center of the room, exactly where the broken capsule was, and turned its head in my direction. Without thinking, I ran for the stairs. The sound of footsteps behind me was fast, as if the thing was running on all fours. I climbed as quickly as I could, feeling the cold air behind me. I reached the ground floor and ran for the exit, but the gate I had entered was now closed. Desperate, I threw myself through a broken window, cutting my arm in the process. I ran through the forest without looking back until I reached my car. As soon as I got in, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the factory in the distance. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then I saw something moving in the second floor window. I got home that night, covered in dust and blood. I threw my clothes away and tried to forget what happened. But since then, I've felt like I'm not alone. Sometimes at night, I hear that same low hum coming from outside my window. When I look, I see nothing, but deep down, I know it's still watching me.